At 38, with 2 decades in uniform, I learned to smell betrayal long before a round was chambered. But this Christmas Eve in the bone-chilling cold of the Chicago suburbs, I realized the most ruthless enemy wasn't out there. She was sitting right across from me at the dinner table. They treated my absence, my service to this country, as an expectation, a perfect excuse to bleed me dry and erase my existence. Without missing a beat, my own mother looked at my frayed field jacket in sheer disgust, then coldly slid a stark white envelope across the glass table. The paper scraped loudly, stamped in bright red ink on the front, "Relinquishment of family rights." She wanted to force me to vanish using my absence as a stepping stone so my little sister could marry into old money. But as I forced my heart rate to slow, pressing my scarred hand flat against that paper, she had no idea the ragged grunt she was dismissing held the one thing that could burn her entire fantasy to the ground. Before I tell you what I slammed down on that glass table, comment below where you are watching this video from and hit subscribe if you've ever had your own flesh and blood turn their back on you for $1. The paper stopped right in front of my plate. My tolerance officially ended right there. The paper sat dead still on the glass, right next to my plate. The steak on it was rare. Bright red blood pooled around the edges, soaking into the pristine white porcelain. Across the long table, Sophia Carter took a slow, deliberate sip of her Cabernet. The heavy crystal rim covered her mouth, but it couldn't hide her smirk. Her eyes dragged up and down my faded clothes. At the head of the table, David Carter leaned back in his high-backed chair. His arms were crossed over his tailored suit. He didn't speak. He just watched, evaluating the room, evaluating me. No one in my family said a word. To my left, Skye kept her head down. She stared a hole into her roasted asparagus. This was the sister I put through college, the girl I sent money to every single month, bleeding my hazard pay dry, just so she could buy textbooks and formal dresses. Now she just dug her manicured nails into the linen napkin in her lap. She chose to be deaf and dumb. She swallowed her guilt to protect her spot as the future daughter-in-law of a billionaire. A silver fork scraped hard against a china plate. The sound shrieked through the massive dining room, vibrating in my teeth. It was suffocating in here. The artificial gas fireplace pumped out a dry, stifling heat that made my skin crawl. Sophia's overpowering rose perfume choked the air, completely masking the smell of the food. Jackie leaned heavily over the table. My mother. Her red acrylic nails clicked against the glass, sharp, impatient taps. She jutted her chin at me. Her voice was a low whisper, but it cut like broken glass. "Don't make this hard on everyone." She flicked her finger against the envelope. "Take the attached check. Pack up whatever trash you have in that rundown shack and leave. This family isn't harboring some broke loser trying to ride the coattails of our in-laws." I looked down at my sleeve, faded olive drab, frayed threads hanging at the cuff. The fabric was washed 100 times, but it still held the faint memory of my own blood. Spilled in a freezing snowstorm halfway across the world just to do a job no one else wanted. Now sitting in this overheated velvet-lined dining room, she priced my entire life. $50,000. That was the going rate for my permanent absence. My stomach cramped, a hard, cold knot. My jaw stayed loose. My face stayed entirely blank. Anyone else would have flipped the table, screamed, thrown the wine. I took a breath, inhaled the stifling rose-scented air. Held it in my lungs for 4 long seconds. Let it out for 4 seconds. I didn't look at the paper. I kept my posture dead straight, shoulders locked back, spine aligned. I scanned the room, sweeping the corners, the exits, the faces, just checking the layout, looking for hazards in the open. My eyes finally settled on Jackie. Her pupils dilated. Her fingers twitched on the glass. She hated this silence. People who run their mouths always fear the quiet ones. They expect you to yell back. They feed on the drama. When you don't give it to them, the void terrifies them. I slowly raised my left hand. The thick white scars running across my knuckles caught the dim chandelier light. I brought my hand down, pressing my palm flat against the crease of the contract. The rough edge of the thick paper bit into my scarred skin. I didn't move it, I just held it down. Jackie's jaw tightened. She saw I wasn't reaching for a pen. Her fake patience snapped. She dug frantically into her expensive leather handbag. Her hand jerked out, gripping a thick black permanent marker. Click. She popped the plastic cap off. The sound echoed loud and dry against the thick glass table. Instantly, the sharp, heavy smell of alcohol and cheap ink hit my nose. It cut right through the roasted meat, right through the suffocating rose perfume. That cheap chemical stench grabbed me by the throat. It yanked me straight backward. Back to a freezing kitchen 12 months ago. Back to the exact days she used that exact same black ink to erase my entire existence from my own home. The harsh chemical stench of that black marker yanked me backward. Exactly 12 months back. To the day Sky first brought Elliot Carter to the house. I was standing in the dark corner of our old kitchen. The smell of stale grease hung in the air. I watched Jackie frantically erase my existence. She stood on her tiptoes, her acrylic nails digging into the wood as she ripped my shadow box off the living room wall. A thin layer of white drywall dust drifted down, coating the scuffed floorboards. She didn't even glance at the heavy metal inside. She shoved the frame into a damp cardboard box. Rape! The plastic packing tape shrieked violently as she sealed it tight. She kicked the box into the pitch-black corner of the garage right next to the trash cans. In its place, she hung a generic, glossy oil painting, bought on a maxed-out credit card just to impress a billionaire's son. Later that night, the house was dead quiet. I opened the fridge for a glass of water. A bright yellow sticky note slapped me in the face. It was pressed right next to a chilled bottle of Sophia Carter's favorite expensive wine. Jackie's neat cursive handwriting spelled out the script for my sister, if they ask. Brisa was sent away for good. She killed me off right there. On a 3-cent post-it note. To Jackie, a daughter without a corporate degree, a daughter who wore faded olive drab instead of silk, was a disease. A roadblock to high society. She had no idea that disease was the only reason the mortgage on that very house wasn't in foreclosure. Her absolute ignorance didn't surprise me. It was predicted. 6 years ago. The ICU room. The memory was permanently frozen in my skull, locked away in a cold, dark room. Outside the rattling hospital window, the bitter wind off Lake Michigan howled. The draft seeped through the cheap glass, freezing the sweat on my neck. My father, Luke, lay trapped under a mess of plastic tubes and thin, scratchy blankets. The steady mechanical beep of his heart monitor was the only sound keeping the sterile room alive. It smelled of bleach and impending grief. He used the last ounce of his failing strength to pull my collar down. His hand was ghost white, freezing cold. The grip of a dying man. Your mother will sell out everything for a cheap image. He wheezed. His breathing was a broken, wet rattle in his chest. Let her think you have nothing. You'll see her real face. He shoved a thick parchment envelope into my hand, sealed with a heavy drop of red wax, 100% control of his trust fund. Not a single dime for Jackie until the test was complete. His grip tightened on my wrist. His fingernails dug brutally deep into the back of my left hand. They broke the skin, leaving a permanent crescent moon scar. Then the monitor flatlined. A high-pitched, endless scream that shattered the room. I kept his dying promise for 6 grueling years. I lived in a drafty wooden cabin that shook violently in the winter wind. I drove a rusting Jeep that choked out black smoke every time I turned the key. I swallowed every insult, every sneer, every eye roll from my own mother. I became the broke, invisible disappointment she wanted me to be, just to see how far her greed would actually go. If you have ever had to hide your own success or play the fool just to see who in your family was actually using you, hit the like button right now. Comment the word truth below so I know I'm not standing in this alone, and make sure you subscribe to hear how this ends. Now, sitting at this suffocating Christmas dinner, the smell of that cheap marker ink snapped me back to the present. My mother shoved the pen toward me across the glass table. Her eyes were burning with a toxic, desperate impatience. She thought she was cutting dead weight. She thought she was winning. I looked down at the pale crescent moon scar on my hand resting flat against her pathetic contract. The 6-year test was officially over. 8 months before this Christmas dinner, the final crack in the glass shattered completely. A downtown restaurant. sickly yellow lighting reflecting off polished silverware. Maria, an older waitress with thick blue veins, standing up on the back of her hands, approached our table. She was exhausted. You could see the bone-deep fatigue in her shoulders. Her hands shook as she lowered a heavy silver tray of ice water. The tray tipped, just a fraction of an inch. 3 drops of cold condensation dripped off the edge of a crystal glass. They landed squarely on the cuff of Jackie's expensive silk blouse, soaking instantly into the fabric and leaving a dark, wet spot. I reached for my linen napkin to wipe it away. Jackie violently slapped my hand away. The force was entirely unnecessary. Her long acrylic nails dug deep into the back of my hand, dragging hard across my knuckles. A sharp sting flared up. A thin bead of bright red blood pooled on my scarred skin. She shoved her heavy wooden chair back. It screeched against the stone floor, a harsh grating sound that ripped right through the quiet hum of the dining room. She stood up, pointing a manicured finger directly into Maria's wrinkled face. "Do you have any idea what this silk costs?" Jackie hissed. Her voice wasn't loud, but it dripped with pure, concentrated venom. "It's more than you make in a month. Get the manager out here. Fire this clumsy old bat right now." Maria folded in on herself. The older woman shrank back, clutching the heavy tray to her chest like a shield. She started to cry. A humiliating, quiet sob. She bent at the waist, apologizing profusely, begging to keep her shifts so she could buy asthma medicine for her sick grandson. I sat perfectly still. Years ago, in a blistering, dry wasteland far from home, I had shared my last mouthful of stale water with a stranger just to keep them breathing. Now I sat across from my own flesh and blood, watching her try to destroy an old woman's entire livelihood over 3 drops of cold water. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my frayed leather wallet. I slid out a thick wad of $20 bills. Enough to cover the ridiculous dry cleaning bill and leave a massive tip. I held the cash out to Maria. Suddenly, Jackie lunged across the table. She snatched the crumpled bills right out of my fingers. Her eyes were wide, burning with pure, unadulterated disgust. She slammed the money down on her side of the table and pointed a rigid finger at my chest, silently ordering me to sit down. She forbade me from showing an ounce of pity. She wanted to savor this. She was addicted to the power trip, feeding off the absolute thrill of crushing someone who couldn't defend themselves. I didn't argue. Arguing is a waste of breath on people who lack a conscience. I slowly pulled my empty hand back. I wiped the bead of blood from my knuckle onto my faded jeans. Then I rested my spine against the back of the chair. My brain went completely cold. The emotional attachment just shut off. I looked at her and mentally reclassified the woman sitting across from me. She wasn't a mother anymore. That title was dead and buried. The person wearing that stained silk blouse was simply a liability. A toxic element that needed to be permanently cut loose. Right now, sitting at this suffocating Christmas table, the sharp chemical smell of the marker's alcohol dragged me back to reality. I stared down at the crisp white paper lying next to my bloody steak. The legal relinquishment of my family rights. The final insult. Jackie held the black marker out to me. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes demanded total submission, completely blind to the cold reality sitting right in front of her. Every single insult, every silent humiliation I had endured for the last 6 years had led right to this exact second. The waiting was over. It was time to close the trap. A few weeks before that suffocating Christmas dinner, I stood in the dark corner of my mother's living room. The heavy crystal chandelier cast a harsh, glaring circle of light directly onto the glass coffee table. I kept my arms crossed perfectly still in the shadows, watching them work. Jackie and Sky were finalizing the wedding guest list. Sky held a cheap yellow number 2 pencil. Her fingers trembled slightly. She hovered the graphite over the top of the heavy cardstock right under the bold printed heading, Bridesmaids. She swallowed hard. Slowly, in neat, careful print, she wrote my name. Brisa. She looked up at Jackie. Sky offered a weak, pleading smile. She knew exactly what it took to get her to this point. She knew I skipped meals on the road just to send money back so she could buy her high school prom dress. I paid her tuition. I kept the lights on when Jackie spent the grocery money on designer shoes. Sky wanted me standing up there next to her. Jackie's eyes locked onto the pencil lead like a starving animal smelling blood. She didn't say a word. She just reached across the glass table and violently snatched the heavy clipboard right out of Sky's hands. The metal clip snapped shut with a loud crack. Jackie dug into her leather handbag. She pulled out a thick, chisel-tip red permanent marker. She popped the cap off with her thumb. Without a single second of hesitation, she pressed the heavy felt tip hard against the cardstock. Screech! The harsh, high-pitched squeal of the marker cutting across the paper echoed in the quiet room. She dragged a thick, bloody red line straight through my name. The ink bled completely through the expensive paper. "You aren't standing on that altar," Jackie hissed, throwing the marker onto the table. It bounced and rolled off the edge, hitting the hardwood floor. "You aren't giving a speech. You aren't getting anywhere near the Carter family photos looking like that." I didn't look at my mother. I kept my breathing slow, measured. I shifted my cold gaze directly to Sky. This was it. The moment of truth. Tears welled up in my sister's eyes. Her bottom lip quivered. She looked at the thick red line crossed over my name. She looked at the mother who had done nothing but use us both. Then she looked down at the yellow pencil in her hand. She let it go. The pencil rolled across the glass table with a hollow rattling sound. Sky slowly lowered her head. She tucked her chin into her chest and stared blindly at her lap. No defense, no pushback, not a single word. Given the choice between defending the sister who bled to keep her fed and securing a flawless high-society wedding with a billionaire's son, she chose the money. She chose the silence. That single moment cut deeper than any jagged piece of rusted metal I'd ever taken. A clean, invisible slice right through the chest, leaving nothing but a hollow, freezing void behind. My own sister traded my dignity for a country club membership. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. Emotional reactions are for people who still have hope, for people who still believe there is something left to save. I had nothing left to save here. I uncrossed my arms. I reached up and slowly fastened the top brass button of my faded olive jacket, my scarred fingers moving with mechanical precision. My heavy boots hit the hardwood floor. Slow, even, deliberate steps. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I walked straight past the glass table, past the trembling girl I used to know, toward the front entryway. The boundary was completely gone. The waiting period was officially over. I grabbed the brass doorknob, twisted it hard, and stepped out onto the freezing concrete porch. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me without a second glance. The metal deadbolt slammed into the frame with a loud final clack. Outside, the brutal Lake Michigan wind howled in the pitch black, violently whipping the bare branches against the flickering street lamps. The winter air was absolute bone-chilling ice. But as I stood there in the dark, staring out at the empty, frozen street, the wind didn't feel half as cold as the blood pumping through my veins. Christmas Eve, I had just walked off a grueling 36-hour shift. No sleep. My joints ached, a deep, bone-grinding fatigue that settled right into the marrow. I pulled my rusting Jeep up the long, sweeping brick driveway of the Carter family estate. The engine knocked and sputtered before I killed the ignition. I parked the rusted-out metal box right next to a gleaming black Bentley. I didn't care. I grabbed the heavy brass zipper of my faded olive jacket and pulled it all the way up to my chin. I opened the heavy door. My heavy boots crunched into the thick, freezing snow. The ice cracked sharply under my weight. I knew exactly what I was walking into. This was a wolf's den. And my frayed, washed-out clothes were the absolute worst camouflage in a place like this, which made it my best psychological weapon. I pushed open the massive oak front doors. The heat inside hit me like a physical wall. The entryway was flawless white marble. My boots left faint, dirty tracks of melting snow and mud right across it. The loud, cheerful chatter in the grand foyer died instantly. The silence was thick, heavy. Jackie's face flushed bright, angry red. The absolute humiliation of my presence burned right through her heavy makeup. She marched over her silk dress, rustling sharply. She stopped inches from my face. "Couldn't you find a single decent thing to wear?" she hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes darting nervously to the rich people watching us. Over in the corner, Sophia Carter slowly swirled a glass of expensive champagne. She looked me up and down, a slow, calculating drag of her eyes. "Well," Sophia said, her voice floating across the quiet room, She offered a tight, polite smile. You certainly look rustic. It was a polite high society insult, sharper than a straight razor. I ignored the women. Total blackout. My face locked into a mask of cold stone. I didn't look at my ripped sleeve. I didn't look at the mud on the floor. I locked my eyes directly onto David Carter, the patriarch of the family. David wasn't looking at the frayed threads on my jacket. He was looking at how I stood. Shoulders pinned back, spine straight as an iron rod, feet planted wide. He saw the unblinking, dead calm stare of someone who had survived things his money could never buy. He didn't say a word. He just stepped away from his wealthy friends, parting the crowd like it was nothing. He walked straight up to me and held out his hand. I took it. I didn't squeeze to prove a point. I just matched him. Exact pressure. A hard, unyielding grip. A pure, raw transfer of authority between two people who understood how the world actually worked. A sharp spark of calculation flashed in David's eyes. Standing in a room full of fake smiles and rented silk, the old wolf smelled the quiet, lethal authority of an apex predator. Real power doesn't need to scream to announce itself. It just takes up space. If you have ever walked into a room full of arrogant people who judged you by your clothes only to silently put them in their place with pure confidence, hit that like button right now. Comment the word power below to let me know I'm not alone, and subscribe to hear how this dinner ends. I held his gaze for one more second, then I released my grip. I turned my back on the rest of the room and walked with heavy measured steps toward the far end of the long dining table. The board was set. The pieces were in place. It was time to pull the trigger. The plates were cleared. The heavy silence at the table shifted into forced, polite smiles. It was time for the gift exchange. I reached into the deep, worn pocket of my faded olive jacket. My scarred fingers brushed against a small scuffed velvet box. I pulled it out, resting my hand on the glass table. The air in the dining room was stifling thick with artificial heat and the cloying smell of expensive perfume, but my skin felt ice cold. I slid the box slowly across the glass towards Sky. She stared at it. Slowly, her trembling fingers popped the worn hinge open. Inside rested a heavy piece of deformed brass, threaded onto a thick, rough leather cord. The metal was violently twisted, crushed inward on one side, bearing deep, jagged gouges. I polished it myself, I said. My voice was completely flat. I didn't tell them the story. I didn't tell them how that heavy chunk of brass nearly shattered my ribs in a freezing, desolate wasteland thousands of miles from this dining room. I didn't tell them about lying flat in the frozen dirt, gasping for air, holding onto the memory of Sky's high school graduation just to force my eyes to stay open. It was my second chance at breathing. I wanted her to have it. Sky reached out. Her hand shook. Jackie lunged across the table. She moved with the desperate, erratic speed of a starving animal. She snatched the brass out of the velvet box, pinching it tightly between her long, red acrylic nails, as if she were holding a dead rat. "What is this garbage?" Jackie hissed. Her face contorted in pure, unfiltered disgust. "You bring rusty, dirty junk into this house, into this family." She didn't wait for an answer. She threw it. The heavy brass hit the table with a harsh, ugly thud. It bounced, slamming hard against a delicate crystal wine glass. The loud, sharp clatter rang out, echoing embarrassingly in the quiet room. Without missing a beat, Jackie reached blindly into her designer bag. She yanked out a long black velvet case and snapped it open. A blindingly bright diamond necklace caught the chandelier light, throwing cheap, flashy reflections across the walls. She shoved it roughly into Sky's hands. "Now this," Jackie announced, her chest puffing out with hollow pride, "is a real gift." Down at the end of the table, Sophia Carter let out a short, airy laugh. It was a polite sound, but it was packed with absolute cutting mockery. But David Carter didn't laugh. The patriarch of the family slowly stood up from his high-backed leather chair. He didn't look at the diamonds. He walked over to where the heavy piece of brass lay discarded next to the wine glass. He picked it up. His large, weathered thumb slowly traced the deep, jagged scratch gouged into the side of the cold metal. He felt the raw weight of it. He understood exactly what it took to walk away with a piece of metal like that. "This," David said, his voice a low, heavy rumble that instantly silenced the entire room, "is a symbol of absolute courage." He set it gently back into the table. He didn't even bother to look at Jackie. He didn't need to. The words hit my mother like a closed fist across the jaw. Her mouth fell open. Her face flushed a dark mottled red. She had just spent thousands of borrowed dollars on a credit card to buy her way into their good graces, and an old piece of crushed metal had completely stolen the room. Her chest heaved. I could hear her breathing short, furious, ragged gasps. The desperate jealousy was eating her alive right there in her expensive chair. Her fake, polite facade shattered completely. Her hands shook violently as she reached into her handbag for the second time. She didn't pull out another gift. She pulled out a crisp, stark white envelope. Her eyes burned with toxic, unchecked rage. She slammed her hand down and slid the envelope hard across the glass table directly at me. The harsh scrape of the thick paper cut through the silence. The relinquishment of my family rights now sat inches from my bleeding stake. The marker clicked. The countdown was over. The white envelope sat untouched on the glass table. Suddenly, a wooden chair scraped violently against the floor. Sky jumped up. Tears streamed down her carefully powdered face, ruining her expensive makeup. She stumbled clumsily around the edge of the table, placing her body directly between me and Jackie. "Mom, please," Sky sobbed, her voice cracking in the quiet room. "Stop. Just stop it." It was a desperate, pathetic attempt at a shield, and it was exactly 8 months too late. I didn't look at my weeping sister. I didn't reach for the black permanent marker Jackie was holding. Instead, I brought both of my hands up to the glass. I took the crisp white contract. I folded it in half. I ran my thumb down the center, pressing a sharp, brutal crease into the heavy paper. Then I placed my scarred hand flat on top of it. I wasn't signing a damn thing. I lifted my head. My measured 4-second breathing stopped. I didn't need to control my heart rate anymore. The heavy artificial heat in the massive dining room seemed to instantly evaporate. The air was sucked completely out of the space, leaving nothing but a freezing vacuum. I locked my eyes dead onto Jackie. I stopped hiding. I dropped the quiet, broken-down facade I had worn for 6 long years. The washed-up, ragged loser vanished. In her place was the raw, suffocating presence of someone who controlled thousands of lives with a single nod of her head. It was a cold, dead, unblinking stare. Sophia Carter stopped swirling her expensive champagne. She froze in her chair. Jackie's mouth opened slightly. She stopped breathing. They both felt it. The crushing, invisible weight of absolute authority pressing down on their chests. "Who exactly do you think you're kicking out?" My voice cut through the silence. It was flat, unforgiving, cold as a frozen lake. I didn't wait for her to stammer out an answer. I reached inside the deep breast pocket of my faded olive jacket. My fingers wrapped around a thick, rigid piece of plastic. I pulled it out. With a flick of my wrist, I slammed it down onto the center of the glass table. Smack! The hard plastic hit the thick glass with a sharp, dry crack that made Sky flinch. It was a heavy government-issued identification card. The official blue and gold seal sat stamped in the top corner. Below the seal was my photograph. Not a picture of a broke, homeless failure in frayed clothes. A picture of a woman in a perfectly tailored, high-collar dress uniform. 2 heavy silver stars rested on the shoulders, and right beneath the photo, printed in thick, bold black letters, Major General. Sophia Carter let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hand shook so violently she spilled her wine onto the tablecloth. She reached up and ripped her reading glasses off her face, staring at the plastic card like she was hallucinating. Jackie turned completely white. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her heavy blush looking like cheap clown paint. Her eyes bulged. She stared down at the card like she had just stepped on a live high-voltage wire. The illusion was dead. Completely obliterated. They suddenly realized what they had done. They had spent the entire evening mocking, degrading, and trying to evict one of the highest-ranking, most powerful government officials in the country. They thought they were dealing with a stray dog. They had just cornered a wolf. Jackie's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her throat worked uselessly. Panic, raw and suffocating, finally set into her bones. But I wasn't done. Before she could even pull a single breath of air into her lungs, my hand moved again. I reached into my other pocket. The title, the rank, and the power were just the introduction. The real weapon was still waiting in the dark. My fingers brushed against heavy parchment paper and the smooth, hard lump of red wax. I didn't give Jackie a single second to recover. Before her bulging eyes could tear themselves away from the plastic ID on the glass, I pulled the heavy parchment envelope from my jacket. I slammed it down directly on top of the stark white relinquishment contract. Crack. The thick red wax seal shattered against the hard glass. Little red flakes scattered across the table. The Matthews Trust Fund. My voice rang out loud and steady. 100% control belongs to me. The words hit Jackie like a physical shockwave. Her knees gave out. She collapsed backward, her spine hitting the back of the heavy dining chair with a loud, ugly thud. All the air left her lungs in a pathetic, wheezing gasp. The ragged, washed-up daughter she just tried to throw out onto the winter street was the sole owner of the estate. The person paying the light bill. The person paying the mortgage. The person paying for the very silk dress she was wearing right now. Jackie's hands started to shake. A violent, uncontrollable tremor. She leaned forward, her red acrylic nails reaching out, desperate to touch the parchment. Desperate to see her dead husband's signature. I brought my hand down fast. I pressed my palm flat against the paper, blocking her. She flinched, snatching her hand back instantly, like she had just touched a red-hot iron stove. The problem isn't who you were trying to protect, I said. Every word was clipped hollow and absolutely merciless. The problem is what you assumed I was. Her arrogance was entirely stripped away. Her fangs were gone. She sat there paralyzed in her chair, staring at the shattered red wax. Then David Carter laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was a dry, hollow, calculated sound that echoed harshly off the high ceiling. He took a slow step forward, looking down at my mother with a level of disgust, usually reserved for something you scrape off your shoe. I was the one who told you to draft that contract, Jackie, David said. His voice was casual, completely unbothered by the destruction in the room. I wanted to see if a mother could actually be cold-blooded enough to sell out her own flesh and blood just to save face. He tilted his head, his eyes freezing her in place. You proved exactly how toxic your greed really is. A double hit. Sky let out a choked sob. Her legs folded, and she collapsed right there onto the expensive rug, hiding her face in her hands. Jackie turned to stone. Her mouth hung open, but her eyes were completely empty. She had lost her money. She had lost her dignity. And now she had lost her golden ticket into high society. The billionaire she was trying so desperately to impress had just used her as a lab rat and then threw her in the garbage. She was stripped bare. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I reached up my scarred fingers, grabbing the heavy brass zipper of my faded jacket. I pulled it slowly up to my collar. Enjoy the wedding, I said, my voice dead flat. Because that dinner is the last dime of my money you are ever going to see. If you have ever had to watch someone's toxic greed completely destroy their own life, hit that like button. Comment the word karma below to let me know you've seen the truth come out, and make sure you subscribe to hear the final chapter. I turned my back on the table. I left the wreckage behind. I walked with heavy, even steps across the flawless marble floor. I didn't rush. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the massive oak front doors and pulled them wide open. The brutal, freezing winter wind screamed into the foyer, biting instantly into my skin. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing, icy air. It burned my throat. I had never felt so free. 3 days after the fallout, I locked myself inside the drafty wooden cabin. The legal team worked fast. Every single credit card tied to Jackie's name was frozen. Her checking accounts were locked. All her billionaire friends vanished into thin air the second her cash flow dried up. I sat by the small, sputtering fireplace. The bitter black coffee in my mug was ice cold. I held a heavy sharpening stone in one hand, slowly pulling the steel blade of a thick camping knife across it. Scrape, scrape. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the dark, quiet room. I had won the psychological war. I had completely destroyed the illusion. But my chest felt hollow. The tumor was finally cut out, but the open wound was still bleeding. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a demand. It was a weak, hesitant tap. I set the knife down. I walked to the door and pulled the heavy steel deadbolt back. The door creaked open. Jackie stood on the freezing porch. The winter wind whipped around her, violently shaking her thin frame. The transformation was brutal. She looked 10 years older. Her heavy makeup was entirely gone, exposing the deep, tired lines around her eyes. She wore a thin, cheap sweater, shivering uncontrollably. She had walked miles through the freezing snow to get here. I looked down. Her expensive red acrylic nails were chipped and broken down to the quick. The heels of her thin designer shoes were worn completely through, exposing a soggy layer of cheap cardboard underneath. Her feet were soaking wet. I stood in the doorway, blocking the heat of the cabin. I didn't say a word. I evaluated her with the cold precision of someone holding all the cards. Her lips were a bruised, sickly purple from the cold. Her hands shook so violently she could barely reach into her coat pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. The stark white relinquishment contract. It was stained yellowed from dirty snow and tears. Right there, standing on the freezing wet wood of my porch, she gripped the edges of the paper. With frozen, trembling fingers, she ripped it in half. Then, in half again. She shredded it into tiny, pathetic pieces and let the wind carry them away into the snow. Her weak knees buckled. She collapsed entirely. She dropped straight down onto the freezing, wet floorboards of the porch. The vanity turned me into a monster, she choked out. It was a harsh, ugly sob. No manipulation, no calculated tears, just raw, broken shame. I know I don't deserve it. Her ego was burned to the ground. There was nothing left but ash. My father's 6-year test of poverty had completed its job. I looked down at the shivering woman curled up on the wet wood. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. I didn't want to scream at her. I just felt a quiet, heavy exhaustion. I reached out my scarred left hand. I grabbed the shoulder of her thin sweater and pulled her up onto her feet. I stepped aside, letting her walk past me into the warmth of the dark cabin. I shut the heavy door against the wind and locked the deadbolt. I walked over to the small stove and poured a steaming mug of hot tea. I set it on the table in front of her. I will unlock a small portion of the trust. I said, my voice steady, stripped of all emotion. It will be strictly monitored. Only enough for basic retirement living. She wrapped her freezing purple hands around the hot ceramic mug. She didn't argue. She just nodded her head, bowed in total surrender. The punishment was officially over. 4 months later, the wedding wasn't held at a sprawling country club. It was a small rented hall with exposed brick walls and warm, dim lighting. The toxic high society circus was completely gone. Just a quiet room filled with people who actually mattered. Jackie was already inside, arranging the wooden chairs. Her hands weren't covered in expensive blood-red acrylics anymore. Her nails were cut short. The skin on her knuckles was rough, dried out from scrubbing her own kitchen floors and doing her own laundry. She had stopped living like a parasite. A week ago, she took the crosstown bus in the pouring rain. She walked straight into that downtown restaurant, looked Maria in the eye, and handed her a thick envelope of cash along with a handwritten apology. No cameras, no audience. Just a mother finally learning how to carry her own weight. I didn't wear a rented silk gown. I stepped out of my truck into the cool night air. The heavy dark fabric of my dress uniform fit flawlessly, crisp and rigid across my shoulders. 2 heavy silver stars sat pinned perfectly to my collar, catching the amber light from the street lamps. Rows of metal and ribbon weighed down the left side of my chest. They weren't just shiny decorations. They were the physical heavy proof of blood-freezing nights and absolute unforgiving discipline. I pulled the heavy iron handle of the venue door and walked inside. The quiet chatter in the room stopped dead. The crowd physically parted, stepping back in a synchronized wave to clear a wide path down the center aisle. I didn't look left. I didn't look right. My spine was a steel rod, my boots hitting the wooden floorboards with heavy measured thuds. Over by the catered tables, Sophia Carter pressed her spine flat against the cold brick wall. Her hands shook, holding her clutch. She didn't dare make a sound. She didn't even dare to breathe. Suddenly a man stepped out from the edge of the crowd. Gabriel John. A man who had stood by my side in the darkest, most violent places on this earth. He wore his own dark uniform, the creases ironed sharp enough to cut paper. He completely ignored the billionaires and socialites lining the walls. He brought his polished boots together, crack, The sharp, violent sound of his heels slamming together echoed like a gunshot off the high ceiling. His right hand snapped up in a flawless, rigid salute. "General Matthews." His voice was a heavy, commanding bark that shattered the quiet room. That single sharp motion sealed it. The absolute authority in the room was no longer up for debate. The old money crowd stared in dead, suffocating silence. From the front row, David Carter slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. He didn't offer a smirk. He didn't offer another psychological test. He stepped into the aisle, gave a single solemn nod, and held out his hand. I reached out and took it, a firm, heavy grip between two people who understood exactly who held the power. I let his hand go and walked to the front row. I took my place next to my family. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the mother who had finally been broken down and rebuilt, and the sister who was smiling with real, genuine relief. We formed a solid wall, an unbreakable front line. Not a single person in that room dared to whisper a word of disrespect. Real authority isn't used to force people to their knees. It's used to drag them out of the mud and force them to stand up straight. The storm was finally over. I looked around the quiet room, folded my scarred hands together, and found my peace. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and goodbye.